יהי רצון מלפניך השם אלוקינו ואלוקי אבותינו יהי רצון מלפניך
Shalom. Our Torah portion for this week is Devarim, the book of Deuteronomy, which is the fifth and final book of what we call the Law of Moses, the first 5 books of the Bible, the Torah. Let's take a look at the opening verses. Ele hadavarim asher diber Moshe el kol Yisrael be'ever haYordan. These are the words that Moses addressed to all Israel on the other side of the Jordan. Be'ever haYordan be'eretz Moav ho'il Moshe be'er et haTorah hazot lemor. On the other side of the Jordan, in the land of Moab, Moses undertook to expound this teaching. He said, in verse 17, we come across the first law given in the book of Deuteronomy, in Sedra Devarim. You shall not be partial in judgment. Hear out low and high alike. Fear no one, for judgment is God's. And any matter that is too difficult for you, you shall bring to me, and I will hear it. Thus I instructed you at that time about the various things that you should do. The name of this book that we begin this week, Deuteronomy, is interesting. Deuteronomy being the title of this book in English. Actually, it's from the Greek meaning second law, or the second iteration of the law. In some circles, in some Hebrew circles, it's called Mishneh HaTorah, which means a repetition of the Torah. And certainly we find a lot of repetition of what we have already read in the Torah up to this point. Moses rehearses. He goes over what had happened to the Jewish people up to this time. He does it in a concise, digested form. He talks about what had occurred during those 40 years in the desert, and he goes about to explain, or actually repeat, some of the laws that were given previously. We'll see in next week's Torah portion, for example, a repetition of the 10 Commandments in a slightly different form from which they appeared in the book of Exodus. Now it says that on the bank of the eastern bank, the eastern shore of the Jordan, Moses undertook to expound. The word is be'er, the Torah. He begins to explain what this is all about. And we have to ask ourselves, what does Torah mean? When we speak of the Torah, what are we talking about? Are we talking about just those 5 books that we have on a Sefer Torah, on a Torah scroll that consists of Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy? Or are we also speaking about the rest of the Bible? You know, there are another 34 books in the Hebrew Scriptures besides the Torah. Perhaps we are, when we speak of Torah, we're also speaking of the oral Torah, the Torah Sheba'al Peh, as it's called in Hebrew, that oral tradition that gave rise to the Talmud, that gave rise to Midrash, that gave rise to the many, many centuries of Torah commentary that still goes on to this day. What are we speaking about here? Well, the rabbis in the Middle Ages told us that we must not just study the 5 books of Moses. In the Middle Ages, the rabbis affixed portions of the prophets that were to be read, and we read them to this day, with or after the Torah portion is read in the synagogue during the course of the week, especially on Shabbat. Now, why would they do that? It seems to me that the rabbis are telling us that the Torah needs interpretation. And certainly, by the time that the prophets came into their own, in some cases centuries after the Torah was written, they had their own take, their own contemporary issues, their own contemporary point of view that they bring to the Torah. The Torah certainly has moral and ethical precepts in it, but there seems to be an emphasis on ritual law in the Torah. We have an entire book called Leviticus that is dedicated to sacrificial law. And we have many laws in the Torah dealing with dietary laws, dealing with holiday observances, etc. Now, by the time the prophets came along, there were pressing social issues facing the Jewish people, and they wanted to remind us that the Torah, as wise as it is, the Sefer Torah, the books of Moses, are not the end of the story when it comes to Judaism. That when we look at Judaism, we have to look at a bigger picture. Let's see what Isaiah has to say in this week's Torah portion. Lo tosifu hevi minchat shav ketorah toeva hi. Bring me no more futile offerings. Incense is an abomination to me. New moon and Sabbath, the calling of assemblies. I cannot endure festivities along with evil. I hate your new moons, your festival days. They are a burden to me. I can bear them no more. When you stretch out your hands, I will avert my eyes from you. However much you pray, I will not listen. While your hands are filled with blood, wash yourselves, cleanse yourselves. Put your evil doings away from my sight. Cease to do evil, learn to do good. Seek justice, relieve the oppressed, uphold the orphan's rights, take up the widow's cause. Now, we might interpret Isaiah's words as meaning that God doesn't want us to engage in ritual practices, that God had rejected the sacrificial practices of our ancient ancestors and wanted no part of the festival celebrations. That's not true. What God is saying through Isaiah here is that ritual practices without social justice, ritual practices without a sense of obligation to go out and make the world a better place, to bring justice and mercy and tzedakah and decency to this world, are empty practices. Ritual practices can lead to kind of an idolatry. As a matter of fact, he explains that there was a certain amount of idolatry in Israelite society at this time, even though they were apparently keeping some of the ritual laws. They were, however, ignoring the calls of the needy. They were ignoring the orphans and the widows in their society. Notice that the first law that appears in Devarim is a law calling for justice. What is suggested to me, it's not a law calling for more sacrifices, it's a law calling for justice. And this leads me to believe that ritual practice, and I am a Reformed Jew who believes that ritual practice is very important, but ritual practice without a sense of tikkun olam, without that imperative to go out and make a better world, is empty and can be almost cultish, and in a sense leads to idolatry, as it did during the 8th century BCE, during Isaiah's time. Well, I hope that you will read this week's Torah portion and perhaps the Haftorah portion as well, and come to your own conclusions. Shabbat Shalom.
For the sake of those who follow.